Hello everyone, this is my post-play wrap-up video for AquaNox 2 Revelation. I plan on doing more stuff like this, where I play through games and then conclude the ordeal with a review of sorts, going through my thoughts on what it was that we just experienced. For anybody who got to this video first, you can find the entire playthrough of this game on my channel. There is a playlist of it for anybody interested in giving that a watch and suffering through my mumbling and long delays between things happening and me processing how to react. AquaNox 2 sadly marked the end of the franchise, and despite the great promise that both the setting and the marked improvements upon the systems of its predecessor, the projects that were to follow never ended up materializing. Nowadays, there is some hope for a revival of the franchise through a new game titled AquaNox Deep Descent, slated for release sometime in 2020, although we'll have to wait and see if that ends up coming to fruition. In the interest of painting a picture in regards to what ecosystem it was that AquaNox 2 was released in, some other games that came out in 2003 would be the original Call of Duty, Max Payne 2, Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic, Prince of Persia: The Sands of Time, and Unreal 2: The Awakening, to name a few. Compared to most of the notable titles that came out that same year, both before and after, AquaNox 2 seems to not have made as much of a splash into public conscience as many of the others, and while the reviews at the time were by no means glowing, they were also not scathing either. However, this played little part in propelling the series any further. Compared to its peers, the game is graphically unimpressive, with the few visually noteworthy aspects lying pretty much entirely in the atmosphere category. The user interface is decent enough at conveying all of the necessary information to players, however, it does also feature some significant downsides, primarily in the bulkiness and opacity of the targeting reticule itself, which makes it difficult to aim accurately at long range, an issue that is further compounded by the nav points set in the game world, as they are larger than the majority of the enemies encountered, and they are also fully opaque, which means that if any hostiles are lying close to one of these, it becomes quite a bit of effort to land any shots on them whatsoever. The submarines, weapons, and environmental sound work is all perfectly serviceable. The different ships and all of the varying types of weapons in the game have fairly distinct sounds and visuals, making them quite unique and easily identifiable by silhouette, by sound, or by the projectile trail left in the water. The music is also decent, though it is rather limited, and it gets extremely repetitive as the game goes on due to the fact that outside of combat there is little to no music at all, relying on whatever sounds would be in the background at that time. As a result, the more significant portions of the soundtrack is reserved for, as mentioned previously, combat, or generally action-focused sections of the game. One thing that players will quickly learn to recognize is that when the music flares up, you'd best get ready to start shooting, and when the music fades away, combat is over and you can rest assured that the danger has subsided, which unfortunately creates this immersion-breaking dichotomy of now we're shooting and now we're cruising, which, because of how sudden the transition is and how drastic the difference is between these two states, it makes the missions feel like a rigid list of things that need to happen with zero input from the player as to the order in which they get checked off. Which is very much in line with the rest of the game design, in fairness, for better or for worse. Beyond the music and sound effects, there's the voice acting. Now, impressively enough, all of the dialogue in the game is voice acted. As I understand it, back in the day, the game met some degree of criticism on the fact that there is a lot of dialogue when compared to the actual gameplay. After having gone through it just recently, I am inclined to agree with this, and if I were to throw out an off-the-cuff number, I'd say that about 40% of the time spent playing the game is pretty much dedicated to listening to the dialogue or watching cutscenes, without any player participation, although this, I must stress, was applicable for my playthrough, wherein there wasn't too much lollygagging during the missions, nor too much exploration, as well as very little, relatively speaking, replaying of missions. When judging the actual quality of the voice acting, however, things get significantly less impressive. If I were to describe the voice work of this game with a single word, that word would be rough. Now, of course, describing anything with a single word will not convey much detail, and so I'll go on to say the following. Some of the characters are somewhat decently acted, while a lot of the characters end up being kind of samey. This mostly as a result of the fact that the actual cast of voice actors was quite small, and the overwhelming majority of them had little to no prior credited voice work, which will naturally mean that their performance is likely to be somewhat unrefined. And some of them are downright hilarious in how stunted they are. Looking at you, Mei-Ling. Much of the inexperience and the roughness of the performance could have been easily offset with well-written dialogue, and this is where we land into the dialogue section. Given the fact that much of the time spent going through the game is listening to characters talking and giving us exposition, it is unfortunate that more time wasn't dedicated to the writing here, as it would have greatly helped elevate the overall game. Between the nature of the setting and the individual characters' backstories, personalities, and interactions between one another, there was much room to create a gripping story with memorable characters. This game came short of actually achieving this, however, as it eventually became extremely clear that none of the characters in this game really interact with one another almost at all. Nearly all of the dialogue in the game is designed with the story protagonist in mind, with the exception of a couple of instances where the story events require a bare minimum of interaction between others. The cinematics feature narration by our protagonist, which in itself is a bit of a misfire as, at least to me, the voice work for the protagonist was one of the worst out of all of them, and the poor audio mastering in these cinematics is also not very helpful. At times the narration being drowned out by the music or whatever other sounds, but the fact that there were only two such cinematics, the opening and the ending, is something of welcome mercy. Barring these two cinematics, we encounter dialogue in only two circumstances, during missions and in hubs. During missions, the dialogue comes in the form of comm chatter, and this is the only time where more than two characters at a time are involved in conversation. Though none of the NPCs really talk with one another, but rather they more so react to whatever event is taking place. For instance, early on, one character decides to do something contrary to the stipulations of another character, only to have this second express his frustration regarding the failure to follow orders, without actually contacting the offending individual and having an exchange. We could probably count on one hand the times where this is not the case, which is quite disappointing. In hub areas, however, the dialogue is exclusively a one-on-one between the player character and the NPCs, which will inadvertently eliminate any hopes of understanding them beyond those interactions. Oddly, at times, characters are aware of the fact that we were just talking to someone, and have a vague idea of what they looked like despite the fact that they were situated in completely different areas of whatever hub we're in, as well as sometimes knowing what was discussed and sometimes not, which just makes it all very contrived and confusing. Perhaps we're to assume that between every single interaction we have with characters, a significant length of time had passed and they either changed location in the meanwhile or talked amongst themselves in order to account for this. But I'm not entirely convinced myself that this was much of a concern when laying out all of the dialogue, over the pure goal of giving the player those specific exchanges as a means to convey characterization and to inject a bit of drama instead of them making logistical sense. Moving on from the voice work and the dialogue writing, we come to the characters delivering said dialogue. The characters are very one-dimensional. There is almost no depth to any of them, as they can all be completely summed up with a short description or title. The adrenaline junkie, the not just a freak, the tired and obsessed wise man, etc. And they do very little to flesh out these characters beyond that. The ones that do get a bit of attention are, thankfully, ones that we speak to throughout the game, but even for them there's very little work done in this respect. Now, the characters here are, of course, in service of the narrative of the game, and so we get to the story. At some point in the 22nd century, the Earth was struck by nondescript cataclysmic natural disasters, which led humanity to migrate to the seas in order to continue their existence. During the period of the migration, a man named William Drake McGregor, a brilliant scientist, came across a small sea creature on a beach in northern Scotland, which he took to one of his labs to examine. His discoveries were horrifying and drove him to attempt to destroy the creature, but he was not successful in doing so. The creature was said to be made of flesh, gold, and some other metal which did not exist on Earth, and it was also able to reproduce. McGregor was also responsible for the development of the propulsion technology that all of the submarines are reliant on, and which were such a fundamental reason for the survival of humanity in the depths of the oceans. Sometime later, McGregor's ancestor, a woman who was managing Drake Enterprises, the family shipping company, was murdered, and most of the assets of the company were pillaged by pirates. Her husband, Alonzo, supposedly stricken with grief, left their 9-year-old son with his grandmother, and allegedly left to seek fortune in the waters of Aqua. Some years later, once the boy, William Drake, had grown up enough to be able to take over what was left of the family business, took their last remaining freighter and set to the seas in search of adventure. Shortly thereafter, William picks up an SOS call, and as he attempts to lend aid, his freighter gets seized by what he believes to be pirates. Upon his return to the freighter, he is swept in this group's mission seeking treasure, artifacts of legend, and adventure. Over the events of the game, William discovers himself, learns more about his family, finds love, suffers loss, enacts revenge, and ultimately learns of his role to play in a prophecy which even at the end is yet to fully play out. The story throughout the game is conveyed well enough through the events that we take part in and through the characters we meet, on paper. However, in practice, the actual storytelling here is very flimsy as it relies on endless contrivances, on characters making decisions and doing things that either are out of character or are simply nonsensical, but they happen nevertheless as they are what has been ordained as necessary in order to drive the story forward along a very narrow and very unyielding road. The story being told is interesting enough, if nothing else because of the rarely utilized and popular media setting of the game, and the possibilities that it offers a prospective writer, but whether the execution kills one's ability to enjoy said story or not is ultimately down to the individual. Personally, I find myself captivated by the possibilities of other stories written in this world, around the mythos established early on and later teased at the end. But with the clunkiness of the dialogue, the very set-piece-oriented mission design that is so prevalent throughout, over more narrative-focused missions, though some do exist, and just the general paper-thin character work, especially for Drake himself, whom is thrust upon the player to take the role of without being given any way to help shape him through any sort of player-driven story decisions. I must say that the story of the game ends up being quite mediocre in the end. Since I've brought up the missions a little bit, let's talk some more about that. The game itself, and consequently the missions therein, are structured in a very rigid framework. The game is split into a number of hubs, some are cities or outposts, and the rest are the Drake Enterprises freighter, the Harvester, and we alternate between these in a fully linear fashion over the course of the game. We start out in the Harvester, we do a few missions, then we move on to Atacama City. We do a few missions, then we move on someplace else, with the Harvester as our hub again. We do a few missions, then we move on to the Asylum, and so on. In every hub, there are dialogue nodes that we need to interact with in order to drive the game forward, which is to say that we need to speak to the people that are clickable, otherwise we won't have any available missions to play, which makes progress through the game and the pacing of said game extremely rigid. A precious few missions are optional, and they tend to offer little tangible reward for the most part, being merely slight distractions from the main story. But as I'd mentioned previously, these missions are created as isolated set pieces and are not tied into the main story whatsoever. This sounds fairly standard to an extent when talking about side quests, but in one instance it goes a step beyond this, as during my playthrough, I had gone on to start one of these optional missions only to find myself being accompanied by a character whom had, in the story mission I'd just completed before that, been captured and waiting to be rescued in the follow-up story mission, yet here they are helping us out on a botched heist. Despite players going through missions in the order that I had being an obvious possibility, they opted not to pick another character whom would be available at any point during that section of the game to accompany us and thus not have this incongruence happen at all. I am not sure why this is the case, but regardless, this serves to show how unconnected to the main storyline these handful of optional missions actually are. Now, when it comes to the missions themselves, we do have a bit of variety in both map design and objectives, but one very particular type takes center stage, much to the game's detriment. We have a selection of mission types featuring defending stationary objectives, escorting transports from location to location, clearing out heavily defended hostile outposts, a bit of infiltration, a few duels, hell, there's even a race. Mission variety is important in order to spice things up and make it so the game doesn't get too dull or repetitive. However, as I just mentioned, there is one particular type of mission which takes center stage, and that is the escort mission. Hoo boy, the escort missions in this game were the bane of my existence. In order to give everyone a bit of context here, I'll need to bring up the save system for the game. Now, at any point when you are in a hub location, whether it be the Harvester or anything else, so long as you're not in the middle of speaking with someone, you can bring up the main menu and save the game. This is all fine and dandy, however, the moment you begin a mission, you no longer have the option to save. If you hit escape, you're met with the escape menu, however the save option is in the main menu, which you can only go to at this point if you quit the mission you're currently on. This, as I'm certain you've all immediately figured out, means that you have to complete the missions in one go. If you fail, then you need to start the whole thing from scratch. Now, in this respect, escort missions are special. While pretty much all the missions are very hard-coded in the first do this, then do that, then do the next thing approach with no means of skipping ahead, say if you're replaying the mission for whatever reason, this enforced linearity is further exacerbated in escort missions because not only does the player have to follow the objectives in order, to the letter, and only after they actually show up, but now you also have to wait for the NPCs to do so as well, and they are so slow. And if at any point you fail the mission, you have to start over, and wait for the NPCs to waddle their way across the map again, and again, and again, until you eventually get it right and complete the damn thing. Perhaps it's merely my perception making me believe that escort missions are the most common, or it's just the fact that they take as long as they do, but in the end, they're absolutely grueling to go through if you don't nail them on your first attempt. The maps themselves are varied enough, I suppose, though really they do end up being split into three variations for the most part. Rocky landscapes with hills, valleys, and mountains, canyons, and mostly flat beds with man-made structures strewn about. The game offers three-dimensional movement, so it can be fun to try and find spots on the map to use for cover during a firefight, or in some cases to try and confuse the AI, causing them to either give up entirely or to bump into things, letting you have more or less free reign to cover them in titanium fire. Speaking of movement, combat, and AI, let's get into that next. Now, this area of the game is where I'm somewhat unsure of what to really say, since from the very beginning and all the way up until the very end, I had no clue if I was just very bad at the game, if the game was just messing with me, or if the game is kind of a mess itself. To offer some insight into what I mean by this, let's get into some of the specifics of the gameplay, and the arsenal available to us over the course of this adventure. During the missions, we are piloting a small submarine decked out with guns, torpedoes, and other enhancing knickknacks. With the exception of one weapon, the rest have varying firing rates, damage types, ranges, firing spread, and projectile speeds. The one exception is what is essentially a sniper rifle, which as far as I can tell is a hit-scanning weapon. But relative to the rest of the guns, it has very low damage and a very slow firing rate. The sniper rifle is only useful in very niche situations, which come up more so at the start of the game when we initially have access to it, and almost never again in the later stages. In theory, the gun should maintain relevance all the way through the game because of what makes it useful, but the AI and the enemy movement makes this pretty much impossible to have happen at that point. All of the ships that we encounter should, in theory, have a cockpit, so far so obvious, and the cockpit is considered a weak point on all ships, which means that any direct damage dealt to the cockpit is multiplied significantly to the point where a single sniper shot can take out the smaller craft easily. This should apply to the larger ship as well, however this doesn't end up mattering because of the enemy movement and the encounter designs. Enemy movement I can only describe as being both erratic and kind of unfair, since they often end up going in one direction only to stop on a dime and change direction with no time to react. In regular shooters, this wouldn't be too much of an issue, but here, because we're meant to be piloting submersibles, the player's camera movement takes a big hit in the, I assume, interest of making it feel like we're actually piloting a ship. The camera movement being sluggish and taking some work to get it to move and to stop. This makes it extremely difficult to get much use out of the sniper, which then means that we end up gravitating towards the rest of the arsenal for getting the job done. Since all the other guns have varying projectile speeds and ranges of effectiveness, some even going so far as to be useless past a certain range by having the projectiles literally disappear, which, as you'd expect, severely limits their viability in combat, they all require getting used to their own particular quirks in order to begin to use effectively, and that's if you can also get used to the erratic movement of the enemies at the same time. Generally speaking, this degree of individuality, which results from these variables, would be a positive for a game of this nature, if not for the actual specs and their means of acquisition in this case. The guns end up getting split into a small number of categories, with clear upgrades becoming available as we go further and further through the game. The Vendetta Gatling is just a faster firing Vendetta. The Plasma Gun is a stronger version of the Vendetta, with its own spread and projectile speed, so if you want to use the better version, you need to get used to the new one. The Plasma Jet is a faster firing plasma gun, the Plasma Gatling is a faster firing plasma jet. The Laser Gatling is a higher damage plasma Gatling, but it has its own quirks to get used to. Then there are the other types of weapons that we obtain, which have their own unique traits to get used to as well. This all leads to a hierarchy of guns where we start from the bottom and work our way up as we gain access to the better versions. And just as you start to feel like you're used to your current weapon and can start to use it somewhat effectively in combat, you get something new that you need to get used to as well if you want to use it. And it's better at shooting filthy pirates scum, so why wouldn't you want to use it? This ultimately puts the player in this stuck between a rock and a hard place kind of situation, since you're faced with the choice of, do I want to continue using the gun that I got used to, but which is getting outclassed by the new guns I'm getting, or do I switch to the stronger gun but have to spend time sucking until I get used to this one as well? Add to this the fact that the situations that we get put into make it so effective DPS becomes a very valuable trait to consider, since we get confronted by increasing numbers of enemies with increasingly stronger guns of their own and sturdier ships to boot, which means that choosing to not move on to the new shiny gun is essentially setting yourself up for failure. For instance, in one mission towards the end of the game, you need to defend the Harvester from a massive horde of enemy craft. But on top of this, there are also a number of small, slow-moving bombs that are hurtling towards your freighter as well, and you really can't afford to allow any of them to connect. This means that you need to take out the bombs quickly while also getting shot at by several other ships, and having to maneuver yourself into the blind spots of the large craft escorting the bombs as well. Low DPS weapons from earlier in the game simply will not make the cut here. One thing I hadn't mentioned that also plays a pretty large role in the whole sloppy combat dance of this game is that we also gain access to more than the ship that we start out with, and these ships also have their own differences in terms of armor, torpedo slots, speed, agility, and so on, which play a big part in how well we can perform. In the example above, it would be incredibly risky to opt for the sturdy but extremely slow gunboat, since we need to move from bomb to bomb and quickly get out of the firing cone of the escorts before they tear us to shreds, when we can just opt for the more frail but faster and more agile scout. Since I've mentioned the ships that we get to pilot, I must say that I am quite disappointed by how we come about acquiring said ships. The first ship, the smallest and weakest we start out with, is in the freighter's complement of utility craft, which is fine. The second ship is the tough and sluggish gunboat that has a dedicated mission for obtaining it. So far so good. The third ship, a nimble and quick vessel we just find abandoned during an escort mission. It was arguably left there to draw in unsuspecting victims, but it comes across as more of a flimsy reason they ended up going with, because they couldn't find a better place for its acquisition anywhere else. I can come up with a better way to do it right now, as one mission in particular comes to mind as a perfect setup for us to not only rescue a captured crew member from the enemy compound, but we could also steal one of their craft on the way out. Finally, the fourth ship we obtain late in the game for what can only be described as plot reasons, which end up getting abandoned. We supposedly steal the ship because of a doohickey, which lets us use a doodad, but I tried this out and we can totally use the doodad with any of the ships, so... And we also get it so late into the game that we barely get a few missions to play with it as well. To go back to the weapons for a bit more, the game does have a whole aspect of combat that remains quite underutilized, and that is EMP weapons. We're told early on that instead of destroying enemy craft, we can paralyze them instead with an EMP weapon. Great, but the weapon in question has a mediocre maximum range and fairly slow projectile speed as well as a very high energy consumption, which makes it very unfeasible to use in the first half of the game due to the relatively low energy recharge rate on our part, and then in the second half we run into the kind of problem that I've illustrated above, where your ability to take out the opposition quickly while avoiding as much fire yourself becomes paramount, leaving not much room to try to get fancy. There are a small number of missions which revolve around the player disabling certain transport craft after destroying their armed escort, but shy of that, purely as a player decision to use the impactor over anything else, there is very little work done to support this. I am not saying, however, that a highly skilled player couldn't pull this off, and most missions also feature bonus objectives, which I must admit I've missed out on the overwhelming majority of myself, as they don't actually get listed out, you have to sort of figure them out as you go. I'm certain that at least some of those could provide some special equipment that can open up other options by increasing the effectiveness of certain weapons. However, short of following a guide or a walkthrough, the average player will not be able to get all of the bonus objectives on their first playthrough. The aspect, however, that is entirely missing when it comes to EMP combat is, well, the receiving end of EMP combat. There is none that I've come across. Short of one very specific instance where you are also getting fired at by an EMP weapon, your energy shield is entirely pointless because it never gets focused. This also makes the very few special equipment that help boost your energy shield useless as well by extension. Perhaps this was an abandoned feature of the game, it's hard to tell. Regarding the complement of weapons available to us, you'll note that I have entirely ignored the topic of torpedoes, and this is because, quite frankly, the torpedoes feel terrible to use and they basically never connect. There are many different types of torpedoes which should work towards giving the player additional options to work with, but against moving targets you can forget about them entirely, since the tool that you're given to be able to direct incoming torpedoes away from yourself is also available to your enemies, and this pretty much just makes them a waste of time. To close off the subject of combat, I will also mention the fact that the actual enemy variety is somewhat lacking, and that the different enemy ship types are supposed to have their own specific traits and behaviors, but ultimately, short of one particular large craft that you need to make it a priority to not give them a clear line of sight on you in medium to short range, you can engage with all of the small ships in pretty much the same way. Aside from the enemy ships, we encounter small buggies traversing the ocean floor, and the great main stationary turrets, which pretty much covers the entirety of the enemy roster. There's also a one-off enemy type that I won't say much more about because the game didn't feel a need to tell us what they are either, despite the characters knowing about them. It was a decent encounter though. There should have been more fights like that and less pest control simulator. The game overall ran pretty much perfectly on a modern system and on modern hardware, although the one issue is the fact that while widescreen resolutions are supported, at least in the GOG version of the game, it does not support them inherently, which means that the image will be a 4:3 ratio stretched to whatever your resolution is. For me, this pretty much meant that I had to play it in 1280 by 1024 in windowed mode because the stretched image would make it very difficult to play with all the bobbing and weaving camera movement that we end up doing all game long. So then, in conclusion, does this game hold up in 2020 compared to back in 2003 when it came out? Well, that's a fairly difficult question to answer since the game is pretty much just mediocre across the board, with great potential and missed opportunities. That's pretty much what it was like back when it came out as well, except nowadays it's over 15 years old too. I for one enjoyed my time playing it again all these years later, more so than not, though this is mostly off the back of my nostalgia for it. Had I not been familiar with it from all those years ago, I don't think it would have had enough to offer to really keep me playing it until the end. So with all that, thanks to everyone who made it this far into the video, and a further thank you if you'd also suffered through my actual playthrough of the game. I'm super new to all of this stuff, and I welcome any thoughts you may have, either on how to improve or whatever else. If you disagree with anything here, or if I've missed something super important, do let me know, and with that I'll catch you all later. Bye bye.